kicking off a new series called Before I Go. So it's when Jesus invites us to do the impossible. So we're going to be doing this every week leading up into Easter because we're officially into the Lent season, which is basically the season of Easter and focusing on what's going to be coming up on Easter Sunday. So as we jump in, I have a question for you guys. You ready? Has there ever been a moment in your life that you didn't want to forget? Well, the reason why I ask that is because over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the last things that Jesus said to his disciples before he was killed. So you see, Jesus knew that his time with them was really limited. He knew going into this that he was going to die. So he knew the death that was going to happen. And so if he was saying, hey, before I go, here's some key things that I really, really don't want you guys to forget. And so, in fact, some of his most profound statements actually happened in what we know as the four Gospels, and they were right before he died. So some of his biggest things that he said was right before he went, and so the weeks leading up to his death. And so that's what we're going to be spending the next couple of weeks on. Now, some of us might have complicated feelings and thoughts about the Bible because maybe we're really not sure if everything in the Bible is true. But it's hard to deny that the Bible is a really great place for us to get to know Jesus more, right? Because it literally writes 4 different times about his life, death, and resurrection, which is exhibit A of how we can get to know who Jesus is. And it's a way for us to get to know his actual words as well. And so, you kind of can say that the words that he said kind of shaped history in a really positive way in some ways because he teaches us about how to be kind and compassionate and how to take care of others and stuff. And I know that's other teachings, but there's some really great stuff that we learn in there. So in fact, the fact that they were written down is a really, really good thing. Because here's the thing. I think we all know how easy it really, truly is to forget, right? So maybe what you guys are talking about, you go on the best vacation ever, but then you go back to school and it's a normal routine like always, and you kind of forget some of the big things that you thought you'd never forget on that vacation. Or maybe your team plays the most epic game of your life and you win the championship, or whatever the end season game is, and you win on this super big high. But then the season ends, and you all go back to your normal things, and then it's like, yeah, that was pretty cool. And we forget those big, huge moments that we thought we would never forget, but then we do. The moment happens, then you move on, and then it's like it's never happened. Or maybe it's a really cool thing, but it's not as big a deal like when you first experienced it. So the same thing can really happen in our faith, right? Or our connection or a relationship with God. So maybe we're having a really great time and things are going really well in our lives. It's really easy for us to forget how much we truly know Jesus. We could go days or maybe even weeks without even thinking or talking to Jesus, right? I know that I get guilty of that. When things are going great, it's so easy for me to forget my need for God and how important it is for me to talk to God. Or in the opposite way, of when life feels difficult or frustrating, we sometimes do the same thing. We forget the ways that we've seen God work in our lives in the past because we can only see the difficult thing right in front of us, right? Now, the good thing is, guys, is that Jesus knew this about us. He knew this about humans. He knew we'd be forgetful, and so he shares something with his closest friends that I really want to talk about and spend some time on tonight. So Jesus and his closest friends and followers, which are also known as the disciples. So there's 12 core group of friends that Jesus had that he did life and ministry with during his time as an adult. And so they were having a dinner. And it wasn't just any dinner because they were celebrating a really important holiday in the Jewish faith called Passover. Can everybody say Passover? Amazing. If you didn't know, Jesus was Jewish. So that was the faith that he grew up in. So what the disciples didn't realize is that this would be the last meal that they had with their very best friend before he was about to die. And so Jesus, however, knew that. Because of it, he shared some important things with the people that he was really closest to. And so imagine if you guys were having one last conversation with the people that you love the most. What would you guys say before you left? if you're anything like me, you would have no freaking clue what you would say, but you'd want it to be something profound and important. And I can imagine that Jesus felt the same way, right? Maybe that's why he didn't waste his time with his final words or with his friends, with his final time with them. And so hundreds of years before Jesus arrived at on earth, God miraculously saved the Israelites. So like we've talked about before in the past, Israelites are the same as talking about God's people. So these are the stories that we hear in the Old Testament. So maybe you'll hear them being called Israelites or the Hebrews or even Jewish people. It all kind of means the same thing when it comes to talking about people in the Old Testament. Just so you know if I switch back and forth between those words. So God's people were miraculously saved from slavery in Egypt. So maybe you know this story. Maybe you know the story of Moses saving God's people from slavery when they were in hundreds and hundreds of years of slavery. God miraculously ended it with some really big miracles. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because from that moment on, the Israelite people or the Jewish people have had a tradition of remembering the Passover. So Passover is the holiday that they were celebrating. And so what they celebrate at Passover is this liberation from slavery that God brought them out of for the people, right? So they have a meal to celebrate how God rescued their ancestors. They gather around a table, just like many of us do on holidays, and retell the story of how they were once slaves, but God set them free. And then they were a free people. So they made it a habit of remembering, guys. They didn't just pretend or think or, maybe try to say that they would remember. No, they made sure that they would always remember how faithful that God was with them. So they set aside time. They put it on a calendar, and they got intentional about telling the story of how it happened, generation after generation after generation. So even like us, just like many of us, our holidays include foods, right? So what happens on Passover is part of the meal involved eating bread that didn't have any yeast in it. So it kind of looked like this. Naan bread, actually, I looked it up, naan bread has yeast in it. So it's flat bread, unleavened bread, which means it doesn't have any yeast in it. Because here's what happens. Unleavened bread is made without yeast. So the reason why they would have specifically unleavened bread on this holiday of Passover is because the Israelites went out of Egypt and ran away from Egypt so fast that they didn't have time to let their bread rise. And so they had to make their bread really fast so that they would have stuff to eat as they were on the run, as they were being set free, as they were running away from the Pharaoh. And so they would also have wine. They would have it because it represented the blood of the lambs that were sacrificed during one of the plagues that God used to be able to set the people free from Egypt. I'm not going to go into it big tonight, but if you want to learn more about it, I'm very happy to talk more about the story of this because it's a really cool story. But this brings us back to the table that Jesus was celebrating in. So here was these people of the Jewish faith that have had a history of generation after generation after generation of sitting around a table on a specific point during the year to be able to remember this miraculous, wonderful moment that God was faithful to his people, and they gathered around with bread and wine. Remember, Jesus was Jewish, so he grew up celebrating and retelling this story of the Passover along with his family. So now he was going to do the same thing with the disciples. So they probably understood what was about to happen. They were probably going to sit down, and they were just about to tell the story of how God miraculously saved them from slavery. But then Jesus does something different, and he changes the entire tradition. So let's go ahead and look at this. So he says, he took some bread, and he gave thanks to God for it. And then he broke it into little pieces, and he gave each of it to his disciples. So there's 12 disciples. So he probably broke it into a lot of pieces. He said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Break the bread and eat it and remember me. He said, after supper, he took another cup of wine, So this is grape juice, I promise. So let's move on to the next slide here. And he said, this is the cup of the new covenant between God and his people. So this is an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out for you as a sacrifice for you. So friends, this was a huge moment for the disciples. Because even though they may not have understood what Jesus meant in that moment, because they couldn't understand that Jesus was about to die, that they were about to lose their best friend in a really gruesome death, they knew that he had just changed the meaning of their entire tradition of remembering. They had always celebrated and remembered what had happened long ago in Egypt, in this one miraculous moment where God was faithful to his people. But now, it was remembering what he was about to do. The bread and the wine represented his body and his blood. So this is something that you see that we do every month in church, is we break bread and we drink the wine, which is grape juice in the United Methodist Church. We're not here drinking alcohol. Guys, he was saying when he did these things, he was basically saying this. He says, these things now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you and die for you. Every time you eat this bread, every time you drink this wine, I want you to remember. That key word, remember. Remember me. This is Jesus talking. Remember me. Remember my sacrifice for you. Remember my great big love for you. Now, friends, what I love about this moment is it's not so much about this holiday. It's not about this big, really beautiful holiday because, guys, Passover was a special time of remembering, but what about this bread and this wine that was so special? Because you see, Jewish people had these two things every single day. Bread and wine was a part of their normal lives. They would have it at dinner. They would have it at lunch. They would have it on the road when they went. It was their normal food. So Jesus took two of the most ordinary parts of their lives, two of the most common things that you would probably never think of otherwise, other than to when you were hungry and when you were thirsty, right? And he made it significant. Jesus wanted them to remember him every single time that they ate and every single time that they drank. Why is this? Friends, because Jesus knew that life would be difficult and life would be painful, not just for the disciples, but for everyone who read his word in the future, including us. So those promises, those things that he told his disciples to do wasn't just something for his close friends to do, and when they grew old and died, it went away. That was something for us to do generation after generation after generation, and look what happened. This once tradition about remembering God's faithfulness turns into another tradition of remembering God's faithfulness in another way, and that is from Jesus dying on the cross and being a sacrifice for us, so that we can always have the love of God right there with us. Guys, Jesus knew in those difficult moments, it's easy for us to get caught up in what's right in front of us and and forget where we came from. That it's easy for us to focus on the bad and forget the good. That it's easy to forget that Jesus died to demonstrate his great and undying love for us. Guys, remembering, this is the important thing of tonight, the important thing of what Jesus had to say, is remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, what he did in that moment, what he is doing right now in your lives as we speak, and what he will continue to do after we move on from this and every single day into the end of time. Guys, remembering isn't about just being sentimental. Friends, it's a foundation of our faith. The things that we look back on are the moments that will help us continue to get back in our faith when we grow in our faith, or maybe when we mess up and we need to step back to that. Remembering is important. And I think that when we're in the beginnings of our faith, in youth group, it can be really hard Because we can experience those really significant mountaintop moments to where Jesus did something for you. You felt Jesus. Maybe it was at big stuff camps. Maybe it was on a mission trip. Maybe it was in your small group on a Sunday night. Maybe it was just on a Sunday with a conversation with a friend or a small group leader, or maybe in your family or serving in the community. In those moments, it's so easy for us to trust God because he feels so close to us, right? It's easy to know that God's there and that God's good, but the reality is we don't feel that way every single day of our lives. Guys, it's easy to feel far away or to forget why you ever trusted Jesus in the first place. Friends, I want you to know something that's really, really important. Jesus hasn't changed. Guys, he's the same as when he was when you first met him in that big moment, or maybe that small moment. He's the same as he was in camp or in a really great worship or prayer night. He's the same God that was on that mission trip or in that conversation with your friend to where you felt the Holy Spirit come into the room with you. And he's the same when he was at the first Passover, of when he liberated the people from Israel or from slavery in Egypt. He's the same when he was at that Last Supper. He's the same in those moments when you're having a really hard time. God doesn't change, and Jesus is God in human body. So this was God talking when Jesus broke that bread and he gave out that wine. Because we just have to remember who God is and what God has done for us, and everything else comes out of that. And so here's how we can start doing just that. So the first thing is it's really easy. We can make a list. So guys, make a list of the things that you've seen God do in your life. Or maybe if you haven't seen anything God has done in your life, make a list of what you've seen or heard of God do in the life of others that's close to you, or maybe your small group leaders or your other friends. Let this list encourage you and give you hope that Jesus is still working in your life and in the world around you. The second thing is to choose a reminder. So in the same way that Jesus chose bread and wine as a reminder for his disciples, choose something in your life to be a reminder of what Jesus has done for you in your life. So food related or not food related, what is something that you use or see every single day that when you look at it or when you do that action, that can be a reminder of God's love for you? And then 3, look for God. This could be as easy or simple as asking yourself at the end of the day, where did I see God today? Because friends, when we start asking ourselves that on a regular basis, or when we're asking our friends that and we know we're holding each other accountable to that, we start actively throughout the day seeing, where am I seeing God, so that I could be thinking of it later. And then you know what? We're going to start seeing God more because we're paying attention to what God is doing in our lives more. That's a great question to remind you to look for God in your everyday life, because guys, God is not going to show up every single time in those big miraculous moments. He's going to show up in those whispers. He's going to show up in that hug from a friend. He's going to show up in a kind word from a stranger, or maybe just from a really beautiful day, or maybe from a rainy day and you have a cozy blanket. Those are the moments that God shows up most in. It's that sometimes we forget to look for it and forget to remember that God is there with us in every single moment. Guys, remembering allows us to trust God, even when it's hard to see how God is working. So guys, remembering helps us see God, what he's done in the past, what he is doing right now, and what he will continue to do, because God is faithful and he has not given up on us in all of this history, and he will not give up on us in the future and what we have a lot ahead of us in our lives.